Welcome to Secure Software Development. We're going to start today a little differently in that a little more somber note. So there are lots of people in the world who rely on the ability to preserve their privacy. And they could be a political dissident, like Jamal Khashoggi. They could be a member of a religious minority. They could be a member of an ethnic minority, a whistleblower. They could just be a woman in a very repressive society. And these people depend on privacy protections to keep them safe. And there are many others, right? Refugees and migrants, victims of domestic abuse need to be able to preserve their privacy while things are working their way through the courts. Labor organizers, basically anyone who is opposing the prevailing power structure probably needs to have pretty good privacy protection. And it's not just that. It turns out that privacy violations can have these fairly wide-ranging or wide impact kinds of effects. A study by some folks, I think Sung Choi is no longer at Vanderbilt, but a couple of the folks there at the time did a study, and they were doing a number of studies about data breaches, and this was sort of one additional one where they asked, does a data breach have an impact on patient care? And they used acute myocardial infarction, or AMI, as a way to study this, because when it happens, it happens suddenly. It's not something that you're typically self-selecting a hospital for, right? It happens in the hospital, like right then. So it removed a lot of variation from the data. What they found might be a little surprising. What they found was that a data breach was associated with an additional 34 to 45 deaths per 1,000 AMI discharges per year. So a moderate, a statistically significant number of people were dying following a data breach. Why would that be happening? Well, a lot of things happen in response to a data breach. One is you may get new systems. You may get new constraints or controls. There may be changes in staffing. All of those things can sort of work against the way the system was functioning before. So one of the things they point out in the paper is that there's been this steady decline in mortality due to AMI. As our care is getting better, we're improving the way we handle it. It's steadily declining. And this can erase, a year or two of progress because of a setback to the entire system that tries to deliver care in this event. So frustrated clinicians might bypass the new system. That creates opportunities for errors, and there are other unintended side effects. Mortality rates persisted for 3 years subsequent to the breach, or I should say elevated mortality rates. So this was a fairly significant bump in the number of deaths, and it persisted for a time. So, there are long-term and fairly serious impacts to this. And I'll close out with the story of Rebecca Schaefer. Now, Rebecca Schaefer didn't die as a result of a software flaw, but she certainly died as a result of failure by the people who had her data to properly protect that data. So she was an actress, television actress. She had starred in My Sister Sam, and she was looking for new roles. And one of the roles she was being considered for was in The Godfather Part 3. She answered the door one day expecting someone delivering a script, and instead a stalker shot her in the chest. She died shortly thereafter. He found her location by paying a private investigator who in turn got it from a government database which had no privacy protections in place. If there had been privacy protections in place, I think this would have been a lot more difficult for him to get her information. It's very disturbing, and it just highlights the fact that privacy is important, right? Privacy is important. Implications for software development? Well, the main thing here is just to remember, put in your brain, that privacy is actually important. Protecting the privacy of your users is your moral and your ethical duty as someone who creates a software system, right? You're going to be building modern software systems. Those are typically deployed in the cloud or online, and so they can be accessed from anywhere in the world. And they may contain data about people. They may contain sensitive data about people. It's even if they don't contain sensitive data about people, they may still contain data that can be linked with other data in other data sets to reveal sensitive information about people, right? I mean, doxing happens because people put things together from different sources to reveal information. And what are the problems with that? Well, they range from harassment to swatting to sometimes people get killed as a result of this. And it can happen anywhere. So you need to take this seriously and recognize that there is, and is probably always going to be, a role for maintaining privacy in these systems. If you are going to have someone's data, you have a responsibility to be a good steward of that data. It's a position of trust, right? Having data about the public is a position of public trust, and you have to treat it as such. Let's talk about anonymity. Let's try that again. Let's talk about anonymity and linking. There we go. I can get it out. So a basic idea is that you are anonymous within the crowd of the data set if your record cannot be identified among all the records. All right. So we're looking at all the data and we're like, which one of these records is Waldo? And we search through them and we can't tell. We just can't tell. Okay, great. We know Waldo's in there, but we can't tell which record is his. He's anonymous within that data set. So given a data set, we might want individuals in the data set to be, let's say, relatively anonymous. And the question might be, why not? Why is that? Why not perfectly anonymous, right? So perfectly anonymous would be nice. We take a subset of records, or even a single record, we can't identify an individual. That's hard for a lot of reasons. Being perfectly anonymous would say that if I grab any record out of the database, you can say, maybe that's the person. But, for example, there may be things that sort of tip off that this is more likely to be the person or less likely to be the person. So over there on the right-hand side, I have a couple birth years for people in the class, and one of those is the year I was born. Can you tell which record is mine? And the answer is, of course you can tell which record is mine. So even with this tiny bit of data, you can break anonymity fairly easily. Now, even if records are not obvious, identity can be exposed by linking. And in this case, multiple different sources are combined so that the ensemble of them, when you put all of the attributes together, it reduces or it may break the anonymity of members. So, remember from last time? Dr. Sweeney was able to identify the governor's health records by linking it with other records. And in this case, it was the voter registration records. Voter registration provided certain information. Okay, it let me get from A to B, and then the health records let me get from B to C. And right, I mean, we can treat entries in different data sets as if they are foreign keys to link the data. It's a database term. By linking partial data in A, B, and C, we create a quasi-identifier that would then allow us to identify a particular individual across the data sets, even though we might not be able to identify the individual in any particular data set. Hope that makes sense. Sweeney says the data holder is expected to identify all attributes in the private information that could be used for linking with external information. Such attributes not only include explicit identifiers like name, address, phone number, right? Those things uniquely and specifically identify you, but they can also include attributes that in combination can uniquely identify an individual, such as birth date and gender. The set of such attributes is a quasi-identifier. And you remember last time she showed you could find 85% of the people in the U.S., at least in the 90s, using just 3 pieces of information. So let's think about quasi-identifiers a bit, and let's try to put some math around this and try to understand what's going on here. So given a population of entities U, that's that clump of people up at the top, and an entity-specific table, and that's that table in the middle. And you see the A1 through AN, those are the attributes. And you can think of those as being the columns in that table. So a quasi-identifier of T, which we'll write Q sub T, is a subset of those attributes, right? So it doesn't have to be all of them. It could be, we could find like 3, like Sweeney did, or 4, or some number of them, such that we can do that bottom piece down here. I can take the table, I apply F sub C. What's F sub C? F sub C encodes someone from the population into the table. Okay, that's what that does. I encode person I in the table. I then select out just those quasi-identifier columns. And then I apply another function, F sub G, that's my generalized function here, that takes me from the table. And in this case, it yields a specific person. It might yield a small subset of the rows, and I know the person is among that small subset, or it might yield a particular row, and I know the person, I know their data immediately. So there you go. If V is a table of voters, for example, a quasi-identifier for V might be name, address, zip code, birthday, and gender. Right? That's enough information to get you there, to get you to the specific person, right? Because name gets you there, address gets you within like a couple people, zip, birthday, and gender, remember from last time, that will get you 85% of people. So those things are all giving me the ability to anonymize these records, or to identify someone within the records. The basic idea is that a quasi-identifier allows linkage attacks on database privacy. Now, which attributes in combination are quasi-identifiers? That's the trick, figuring that piece out. And it really depends upon what other kinds of data are out there and how much variation there is in those attributes. If the combination of attributes is very specific to a person, then I'm able to break it fairly easily. Whereas if it's fairly homogeneous across the data set, it may be very difficult. Now, we can try to identify which attributes are sensitive for linking, but we might get it wrong, and we could release data which is less anonymous than required. So naturally, we like to take what we've built here, sort of our formal approach to this, and formalize the entire process. And that leads us to k-Anonymity. So the idea behind k-Anonymity is this notion of group indistinguishability, right? If I'm in a group, I should look just like everybody else, right? I shouldn't stand out. Suppose we take a group of records from the database that contain our person of interest. The individual might blend in with that group so that they end up being indistinguishable from the rest of the group, given whatever features there are, right? Features are like columns of the database table, and then individuals are rows. So, for example, suppose I select 100 records from a database. The records might contain the person of interest, but I can't figure out which specific record belongs to the person of interest. And in that case, they're indistinguishable within the group given the set of features I have available to me. Group indistinguishability seems like a reasonable idea. Let's try to make it formal. And so here we go with the notation again. So we'll let D of QD represent projecting our quasi-identifier, QD, remember that's our collection of attributes, onto the database. So in this case, we are selecting, instead of selecting a set of rows, we're selecting a set of columns from the database. And we'll let DQDR denote the projection for row R. So if we then have just those columns for just that row. So remember, a quasi-identifier is a set of database columns. So our projection is just a subset of the columns. And DQD of R, that just gives us the values for those columns for a particular row. If we say two queries are indistinguishable, we would like that to be, we've taken the database, we've projected the quasi-identifier onto it, so we selected a set of attributes, and then we look at row 1 and row 2, and we can't tell them apart. If we could see the other attributes, like name and address, we would be able to tell them apart. But by just selecting for those, they end up being indistinguishable. And it could be that they are exactly the same. We kind of like that. Or it could be that they are sufficiently close that we can't say with probability 1 which row is which. Okay, and we have a little notation for that using the tilde. We say those two are indistinguishable. And now we get to the main part here. A data set satisfies k-Anonymity for some k greater than 0. I don't know what 0 anonymity would mean, or 1 anonymity. 1 anonymity seems like that's a bad idea, right? 2 and up is what you want. It satisfies that if for all the rows, there are at least k-1 other rows that are indistinguishable. Does that make sense? So I go in and I say, hey, I want brown hair, blue eyes, age in the range 20 to 30. Give me those records. And I don't get back one unique record. If I did, that would break the idea of anonymity. I get back at least k records. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I can't tell which one it is among those. Hope that makes sense. Now, can we take a data set and make it satisfy k-Anonymity? And the answer is sure we can, right? I mean, trivially, I could just produce k-1 copies of it, just duplicate the rows that number of times, and, that's silly. That means when I select, I get k rows. They're all the same. That's not what I want. But we can use the idea of generalization. So suppose I go in and I say, I want brown hair, blue eyes, age 23, lives in Milwaukee. I am getting really close to pulling a particular person out, even though each one of those is a fairly general thing, right? Lots of people have brown hair. Lots of people have blue eyes. Lots of people live in Milwaukee. Lots of people are 23 years old. In this database, that may be enough to give me a specific person. So what I may want to do is coarsen that so that I can't ask, for example, 23. I have to ask age 20 to 30. Oh, and now I get a bunch of people, and I'm like, I don't know which one it is. Right? So that's an idea of coarsening the data. And we typically think of coarsening as a hierarchy. Right? So maybe I bin the data, I put it in these bins, and I give you age to the nearest 10, and that turns out to not be sufficient. So maybe I give you age to the nearest 20, and that helps. Or maybe instead of zip code, I give you just the state of residence. Okay? Remember, zip code is one of the things that Sweeney used to find the governor. Or maybe I give you a subset of the zip code, like the first 2 digits or something like that. So I coarsen the data. So that makes some field values that were previously distinct indistinguishable. And how do we check k-anonymity? Well, for each row, we run a query with the feature subset, and we just count the rows returned. And the maximum we ever get should be k. So it turns out we can do that pretty quickly. Another problem is outliers. Sometimes there's just people that getting to a case where we generalize enough that you can't find them, that basically kills the entire data set. So we have a bunch of people in our data set, but there's only one 110-year-old in the data set. It's going to be, we're going to have to do a lot of work, a lot of coarsening to make that person indistinguishable. So maybe we just don't include them. Maybe we just remove that outlier. So suppose you want to release a data set and you want to have k-anonymity. How do you do that? Well, let's go through the database and let's figure out for each attribute, is it an identifier like name, social security number, address? Well, unsurprisingly, the solution there is to just drop those. Don't include them. Is it a quasi-identifier or part of a quasi-identifier? Well, then in that case, maybe we suppress it or generalize it. What are those? Age is one, for example, right? We had hair color, eye color, city, and age. Those together formed a quasi-identifier, and we might coarsen it by coarsening age, or by, instead of including city, just including state. Okay? After this process, you should be able to test and verify the k-anonymity of the data set. And to get more specific, for those of you who love SQL, so I can just count the rows where age is 15 and state's Tennessee, and I get 4. So maybe I'm trying to satisfy 4 anonymity. If that's true, whatever I put in there, great, I've satisfied 4 anonymity. I could get 0 out of that. That's fine, right? 0 is fine. 4 is fine. 5, 6, 7 are fine, but 3, 2, 1 are not if I'm trying to satisfy 4 anonymity. So building a k-anonymous data set assumes you can correctly classify these attributes as identifying. And that presumes you understand the potential for linking to external data. And we're going to take a deeper look at that, because at no point have I specifically clearly articulated the exact mathematical criteria for being a quasi-identifier. I've just told you those are the things that you use to link. So suppose you have anonymized hospital records, but you know that a particular individual was admitted to the hospital on a certain day, right? You have that piece of additional information. It's not something I got from the database. It's something that I know from maybe another source. By using that and linking it with information from the hospital, I may be able to find a particular record for that individual. I've gone through the work of making it k-anonymous. So when I pull the data out, I get, I say brown hair, blue eye, age 20 to 30. And it's like, here are your 6 records. But I look at the admission dates, and I'm like, only one of those was admitted on the date that I know this specific person was. That is the record for that person. And there you go. The key challenge for k-anonymity is that there is no rigorous and verifiable definition of identifying, non-identifying, and quasi-identifying, right? We can do really well with identifying, right? It just tells you who you are. Great. We can get a pretty solid definition of that. But the others, that's tough. With the right set of additional specialized information, essentially any attribute might end up being quasi-identifying. And so the challenge of this is to figure this out, and it's hard. Ideally, we'd like to do the least harm to the data set. I'd like to coarsen the data set, maybe drop some records to get to a state where I have good anonymity. And I'd like to do the least harm, right? We think of that as the minimal approach to k-anonymity, and we've shown that to be NP hard. So it's tough. So let's talk about attacks on k-anonymity. I've been sort of leading up to this idea. One attack you can apply on just the data itself, you don't need additional information, is a homogeneity attack. So suppose I select a group of records that contains an individual of interest. Brown hair, blue eyes, age 20 to 30, lives in Milwaukee. I get back a bunch of records, and I know the person is in that set of records. Maybe I can't figure out which record is theirs, but if it happens that all the records have the same value for a piece of sensitive information, like a diagnosis, then I can say, look, they've all been tested positive for HIV. I know that my person is in that clump. I don't know which one they are, but they've all tested positive, and therefore I know the sensitive information for the person of interest. I know they tested positive. And I didn't have to identify which record was theirs. Okay? That's a homogeneity attack, and something we don't want. We need greater diversity in the sensitive attributes when we do this. And we'll come back to that later on. Background knowledge attacks. So here's where we bring in other information, right? We might have additional knowledge about attributes and how they link with the sensitive information. For example, I might scrape social media, right? I go through social media, I find pictures of you in the hospital on a certain day. Now I know when you were in the hospital, right? You post a picture of you in the hospital, like, oh, must have been admitted that day or the previous day. Home again. Oh, you were released that day or maybe the previous day. Now I know your span of stay in the hospital. Maybe I can use that to find your record. Okay? Background information acts like metadata, and we can use it to break anonymity. And it doesn't have to be, very super precise like I just described. It could be statistical information. Suppose our subject is known to be Japanese. Heart disease has a very low incidence in Japan. So one of the things we might do is exclude any patients who have an ICD-10 code that says, oh, they have been diagnosed with heart disease. Is that perfect? Might that exclude our person of interest? It might, right? It might, because it certainly is possible for a Japanese person to develop heart disease. But because we have this information about it being less likely, it's probably a good way to guess. And so we make a series of likely guesses to narrow down what we see. Suppose we know our subject's female. Well, we just exclude all records where the subject has had a prostate exam. Again, it's not perfect, but we can get to a state where we have narrowed down the scope. And maybe as we narrow the scope down using this kind of an approach, we can use other kinds of techniques to try to reveal the information, right? I narrow the scope down until I wind up with a homogeneous group, and now I know the result, even though I never actually identified the record for the person of interest. So I mentioned diversity a couple of times. The idea of homogeneity certainly is a problem. We'd like to address that, and that takes us to L diversity. So k-anonymity is on generalization and suppression. L diversity is a very similar approach. In fact, we'll cover this later. L diversity is the property of a data set that measures the diversity of sensitive values for each column in which they occur. Right? So again, if I select a group of records and they all have the same value for the sensitive value, that's no diversity. That's 0 for my diversity. That's bad, and I can use a homogeneity attack. So we want to use this concept of diversity to prevent homogeneity attacks and even to prevent background knowledge attacks. So a data set has L diversity if there's a value L, so that for every set of rows with identical quasi-identifiers, brown hair, blue eyes, lives in Milwaukee, there are at least L distinct values for each sensitive attribute. So again, I'm trying to find out, let's say, whether this person's been diagnosed with HIV. I say brown hair, blue eyes, age 20 to 30, lives in Milwaukee. I get back 6 records. 3 of them say yes, 3 say no. I don't know. I haven't gained information. And so that can help me defeat the homogeneity attack. It can also help me defeat the background knowledge attack because, remember, I got back 3 yeses and 3 nos, and that could be true for a lot of other fields, and so that increases the entropy or the uncertainty of the sensitive attributes and makes it more difficult, potentially, for me to link them. So how do we get to this? How do we get to L diversity? So over here on the right-hand side, I have a little small data set. And we can do some stuff over here to try to improve the quality of this data set, right? If I come in and I say, woman from Kentucky, I know the age because it's homogeneous, right? I come down and I select that little bracketed group. I get back those 2 records, 2 anonymity. That's great. But I know the sensitive characteristic. I know 25. I've discovered the age without having to know anything except the sex and location. Doesn't work for any others, right? If I try a female from Georgia, could be 26, could be 27. It's a narrow range. If I say male from Tennessee, 21, 24, right? It doesn't work for any of the others. So we have 2 anonymity. We don't have 2 diversity. So what do we do? How can we address that? Well, one thing we might do is combine some equivalence classes. And a way to do that is, for example, to redact the location. So now I just have 2, male and female. And for male, I have ages 21, 24, 26, 27. And for female, I have 25, 26, 27. And I don't get the sensitive attribute right out there immediately. I lost an attribute doing that. I lost location. So our queries are more generalized than they were before. Another thing we might do is just throw away one of the female records. We just drop it. And to preserve 2 anonymity, when we drop that record, we still end up having to redact the location. So in this case, we lost both a record and a row. But it turns out for a large data set, you may be able to do that, and it may be preferable. Usually there's, for the implementations of this, there is a loss metric you can use to control how many rows you're willing to drop before you're forced to then further generalize or redact. So to achieve L diversity, we dropped some records. Now, in dropping a row, we may be skewing the analysis of the data. And, right? I mean, think about this. If I'm throwing a row away, I'm certainly, potentially changing like the average. I'm certainly changing the count. Things are going to be a little bit different. And maybe that's tolerable, or maybe that begins to cause problems. And one of the things that happens is it may make equivalence classes look more similar, right? If you go back, I had to eliminate location. I had to eliminate one of the attributes. So now I wind up with these classes that are much more similar than before. I don't have males from Tennessee and males from Georgia. I just have male. Right? So now I end up with an interesting result here. I wind up, in this case of the previous example, with more males than females in the data set. So if I go back, right, I have 4 males, 3 females. Before it was 50-50, but now I've narrowed it down. It's not quite 50-50. This means our attacker has a higher chance of correctly identifying a particular person in the data because there are fewer of them. Now, maybe we drop that person, but if that person is still in the data, now there's fewer and you're pulling from a smaller population. So skew might actually work in favor of the attacker. Another interesting thing here is similarity of the rows, right? Even though the data set satisfies 2 anonymity and 2 diversity, and in fact here it satisfies 3 anonymity and 3 diversity, and you can see that because I wound up with these 3 rows that are female, 4 that are male. So I satisfy 3 anonymity and 3 diversity because for female I have 3 different ages there. We can still conclude something about the range of values, and that may be helpful to us. Maybe that's getting at what we really want, or maybe that's revealing information that I can then link, right? I find out, I know the person of interest is in this data set. I don't know who they are, but I know that their age, let's say it's a woman, is 25, 26, or 27. I then turn around to another data set that contains this person, and I say, give me the people who are in that age range. And now I've done some linking, and I might be able to begin to expose information from other data sets. Finally, let's talk about downcoding attacks. Downcoding attacks are fairly recent. Now, I mentioned, k-Anonymity and L-diversity. I mentioned those 2. There are a bunch of others. T-closeness, right? How close are records to each other? K to the M anonymity, a k-Anonymity, P-sensitive anonymity, entropic diversity, etc. There's a ton of these out there, bunch of them. And the dirty secret here is that they are basically all k-Anonymity if we consider every attribute to be a quasi-identifier. So in that case, they all sort of reduce down to the same kind of thing, which means if I can attack a type of k-Anonymity where everything's a quasi-identifier, then I can attack any of those. Now, that would be pretty devastating because k-Anonymity and L-diversity are enshrined in policy. De-identification methods rely on these techniques. Health and Human Services in the U.S., the methods for implementing GDPR in the EU, etc., rely on doing these kinds of things to your data before releasing it. So what's a downcoding attack? Well, it's a pretty new attack from 2022, and it takes advantage of the way that anonymity algorithms do their work. Aggregation for these algorithms is deterministic. I go through and count. I'm like, oh, count's not enough. So I am going to generalize data. I'm going to do something to improve the data set. I can potentially reverse engineer some of that and recover the original data. Now, I don't require background knowledge here. If I have background knowledge, that makes the attack stronger, but I don't necessarily require it. So let's assume that the mechanism used to anonymize the data set is minimal, right? The least harm was done to the data set to achieve whatever metric we wanted. The anonymization method makes choices, right? How the data is binned, if an element ends up redacted. And that means the choice of encoding tells us something about the data. If, for example, we anonymize a Boolean field and we redact it, then it must be the case that the field contains both trues and falses. We use structural information, and we use statistical information based on the data distribution. I'm not going to get too deeply into that. There are wonderful examples of this in the paper, and you might have a look at that and see how they did it. So, all this is bad. These techniques have this set of weaknesses that can potentially be exploited. Let's go back to the spinner idea. Remember, the spinner was super simple, but it allowed us to make very strong privacy guarantees. And k-Anonymity is got lots of math behind it, but at the end of the day, it comes down to this notion of the quasi-identifier, and was still subject to linking, right? Linking wasn't a problem with the spinner because we had already baked uncertainty into the data at the start. So a question would be, can I find an alternate approach that is perhaps more like the spinner model to use instead of something like k-Anonymity? I want strong privacy guarantees. I want to avoid all this linking and re-identification and all of this stuff, downcoding. Can I find an approach that helps with that? And remember, the spinner could be used to add noise when data is ingested, right? When I go and survey people, I use the spinner to do that and add noise to the survey results before I put it in the database. My database ends up having plausible deniability for anyone who is surveyed. Or I could use it on the other side. I've got the real data, but I add noise when I pull data from it so that I can't see what's actually in the data set. I see some fuzzed version of it. Okay? And so maybe there's a technique like this we can use in place of this. And that's what we'll get into next time. There's homework. Let's do in a week. And the homework is to take that data set and make changes to it to achieve 3 anonymity. Now, how are you going to get there? Well, that's up to you. Clearly, some of these things are identifiers. Name is clearly an identifier. You probably don't want name in the result. But other stuff in there, we'll see. Now, I don't want you to have to type all that in, so if you go to iLearn, there's hw8data.py. It's a Python source file that gives you that data. The sensitive attribute, right? There has to be a sensitive attribute. That last column is an ICD-10 code. That's the piece of sensitive information. So you could create it by hand, but my recommendation would be that you use a computer to do it. This is computer science. And I would recommend you check out Pandas to load the data. Pandas is a tool for working with data sets. And once you get the data into Pandas, you'll find that there are some libraries out there that will generate for you a 3 anonymous data set. Now, you're going to have to make some decisions. I haven't given you all the information that you'll need here, so make some decisions. Tell me what those decisions are, and generate a 3 anonymous data set. Turn in the new anonymized data set, and if you wrote code, turn in the source code as well, okay? And if I need special instructions to run it, or special libraries to use with it, include that information in there. That's it.